Okay, good. So sit in a comfortable position. If you're going to have anything on your lap, have it sitting there in a way where it doesn't need any maintenance. If not, just go ahead and put stuff down, maybe in front of you on the floor. Good. Okay, close your eyes. Take a deep breath in. Put your attention on your feet. Feel your feet. Put your attention on your hands. Feel your hands. Put your attention on your head. Feel any sensations on or in your head. Now consciously take the wheel of your breathing. Take a slow breath in. When you get to the top, hold it. And as you hold it, notice that your mind goes quiet. Now consciously breathe out slowly. And at the bottom, hold it. And notice that as you pause your breathing, your mind can also take a pause. Now resume breathing. And what I invite you to do now is see a picture of the future. At some point in the future, when your visions are becoming real, see yourself in that future. See a picture of yourself, as they say, actualized, developed physically, emotionally, logically, on the inside, the outside, achieving the level of success, accomplishment, achievement, love, connection that you'd like to achieve with yourself, with others, with all that is. Notice how your posture is different. Notice how the look on your face is different. Notice how your breathing is different. Excellent. Now make that picture big and bright, very vibrant. Really enjoy that picture, seeing it out there in your future, drawing you toward it. As soon as you've finished enjoying that picture, that vision that you've made in your mind, just come back to now. Wide awake, clear-headed, refreshed, ready for more learning. Now that exercise, even though it was very similar to the one that we did at the beginning of the program, you may have experienced that one slightly differently. This time, there may have been a part of you that was aware of it as it happened, that was saying, oh, I'm directing my mind right now. I'm taking the wheel of something that's normally done by my autonomic nervous system, my breathing. I'm consciously making a picture. Did anyone get a sense of I'm shifting from just kind of receiving knowledge and in autopilot mode to, oh, I'm grabbing the wheel now and I'm going to direct my own mind, I'm going to direct my own attention, I'm going to direct my own body. I'm going to direct my own visioning process. Did anyone notice that they were doing that more than the first time? Good. Okay, so a good percentage of us. So that's a hint. Excellent. All right. Just quickly, here's what I want to do. Look over your notes. Just take a quick glance through your notes from the first sections. By the way, I wasn't clear yesterday, and this will work out okay, but I said that this was the last time we were going to do the exercise with the challenges. It's valuable to keep all your exercises with you through the whole event, okay? Make sure you keep all of them with you through the whole thing, because we'll need to refer to them throughout other exercises. Even though we're leaving them behind and we're not doing them, we're taking the information and moving it to another dimension. Okay, so look back through all of your notes, look back through your exercises, see if you can get a feel for your progress. Okay, see if you can notice any transformations in your own way of seeing things, anything that's really valuable that you're going to take with you into this next section. It's going to take 3 minutes to do that. Okay, just a quick review. What is thought? What is thought? What is thought? Anyone? Energy. Thought is energy. Okay. Maybe we could come up with a description of it that's a little more specific. Let's narrow in a little bit. Because, sure, energy, great. Emergent property of neurons. Okay, good. What else? Energy correcting the neural system? Yep, connecting the neuron system. Creative focus? Okay, interesting. Something you need to control. A cognitive process that helps us make sense of the world we live in. Yeah, information. Thought is information. Mentally asking and answering questions. These are good definitions. This is good stuff. Anyone else? Consciousness. What was the other? Currency. Thought is a currency. Good. What do you think thought is? What do you think thought is? No, it's a good question. What do you think thought is? In a weird kind of way, it's like asking a fish, what do you think water is? We only invented air a few hundred years ago. Really. Up until a few hundred years ago, we didn't know that we were interacting with the environment constantly. We didn't know that. We just figured the air thing out. Write it down right now. Write down your answer. What do you think thought is? There are no wrong answers. As they say, there are no stupid questions. There are only stupid people asking questions. That's a joke. Well, kind of. So what do you think thought is? What did you think it was before I asked you the question? What is thought? Anyone come up with another answer? Yeah?
Thought is the universe's way of understanding itself.
Thought is the universe's way of understanding itself. Well, that's pretty good. Yeah?
Continually evolving reference frame.
A continually evolving reference frame. An expanding frame of reference.
The precursor to action.
Thought is the precursor to action. Excellent. These are all great insights, by the way. What we're doing here as a group is we're looking at thought from multiple perspectives. right? And just like if you saw a big giant building from 1,000 feet away, you'd have one perspective. From looking inside the window, you'd have another perspective. From standing in the middle of it, you'd have a different perspective. That's what we're doing right now with thought. Excellent. Yeah?
The mind's automatic response to environment.
The mind's automatic response to environment. That's a good one. The mind's automatic response to environment. One more. Yeah?
It's a system which the soul and body use to communicate and understand their current experience.
A system which the soul and body use to communicate and understand their current experience. Good, yeah? Reality's incubator. Thought is reality's incubator. Yeah?
Pictorial language of our reality.
A pictorial language of our reality. Yeah.
What happens after context and before action?
What happens after context and before action? God talking.
Brief glimpse of awareness.
A brief glimpse of awareness. Okay.
It's a creation tool to create experiences.
A creation tool. A tool to create experiences. The ability to consider.
It's a unit of energy that's transmuted into neurology that creates change in the conscious or unconscious mind.
Okay, a unit of energy
That's transmuted in our neurology
that creates change in the conscious or unconscious mind.
that creates change in the conscious or unconscious mind.
It's good. All excellent insights on thought. Each one of them takes you down a pathway into your imagination. I mean, we could take each of those ideas, literally, we could take each of those ideas, and as a group, we could do a whole session on it. We could spend a week together just on those insights right there. That's some great stuff. So I'd like to ask you to kind of put on a model that I kind of jokingly came up with in the last session, which is Steven Pinker's book, How the Mind Works. Would have been really interesting if he would have called it How the Mind Works Itself. So we're going to talk about thought right now. And talking about thought, in a way, is kind of like talking about air for a bird or talking about water for a fish. It's literally hard to get your head around the idea of thought because you're trying to use it to understand it. And we can't ever get totally outside. Okay, we can make maps and models and we can do our best to get outside, but we can't totally get outside. So, as long as we're going to be learning about thought, for this session, see if you can notice your thought-ing as we discuss thought. See if you can notice how your mind automatically is doing its thought-ing, and that somehow it's different from what we did in the exercise at the beginning, where we consciously directed our attention, we consciously took control of our breathing, and we consciously made a vision, okay, that was all directed by us. We took control of the autopilot, and then we made pictures of the future. See if you can notice, while we're talking about thought, just a couple of times, thought-ing. You might even notice it now. Just notice it just happening. You notice when you took your hand off the wheel and then you see a bunch of thoughts going, you say, okay, oh, I got it. Right? See if you can just catch it like as you look over your shoulder and it's running away. Just for a second, 'cause that's all we get is a glimpse. Okay, it's like Carl Jung talking about our shadow. You just get to see a tiny glimpse of it. And with that, Wyatt and I are going to have a discussion about thought. Wyatt is one of the people that you'll meet that in the world, in the history of the world, that I think has some lucid concept of thought and experience and vocabulary and can communicate it well and can dive into this challenging topic and really explain it. And so what Wyatt and I are going to talk about are the laws of thought. The laws of thought. And with that, let's just dive right in. So Wyatt, just to introduce this section, when you say the laws of thought, I mean, what's some context? What are we talking about here?
Well, what happened is that a modern gentleman named Alfred Korzybski says that the map is not the territory. So it's interesting in philosophy, you hear things that seem to be obvious. So why would anybody bother to say them? Who thinks that the map is the territory? And so in order to find out who that is, we've got to go back about 2,400 years. And so Korzybski was talking about maps. He says, two important characteristics of maps should be noticed. A map is not the territory it represents, but if correct, it has a similar structure to the territory, which accounts for its usefulness. If the map could be ideally correct, it would include in a reduced scale the map of the map, the map of the map of the map, and so on endlessly. If we reflect on our language, we find that at best they must be considered only as maps. A word is not the object it represents, and languages exhibit also this particular self-reflexiveness, that we can analyze languages by linguistic means. This self-reflexiveness of language introduces serious complexities, which can only be solved by the theory of multi-ordinality. The disregard of these complexities is tragically disastrous in daily life and science. So Korzybski's fighting a war. The question is, what is he fighting a war against? Korzybski created a discipline called general semantics. And semantics has to do with the meaning of words and understanding the relationship between language and the world. And in this discipline, he wrote a book called The Science of Sanity. And he was an interesting individual. He was served in the Russian army. He was a Polish nobleman who served in the Russian army during World War I. And after the war was over, he turned to psychology, and he started studying the verbalizations of mental patients. He would go to mental hospitals, and he would sit and listen to the people talk, and he would write down their language, and he would try to analyze and say what would be necessary for somebody to think the way they talk. And then Hitler started coming to power in Germany, and he started studying the verbalizations of Hitler's speeches, and it scared the hell out of him. And he got out of Germany quickly and went to England and eventually came to the States and created this discipline called general semantics. And then wrote a book called The Science of Sanity. And so then, once again, the map is not the territory. So why bother to state the obvious? In order to understand that, we've got to go back almost 2,500 years. We've got to go back to Greece in the 4th century BC to a gentleman named Aristotle. And Aristotle was the greatest philosopher of his day, along with his teachers Plato and Socrates. And he was really a brilliant observer. And he looked out at the world, and he listened carefully to the people that surrounded him and to the way they talked. And he wanted to know, what is the relation between language and the world? And if we looked at the structure of the language and the structure of the thought contained in it, then, and made that explicit, then what would be an accurate characterization of the way that people thought? And he came up with what he called the laws of thought. And so he observed the behavior and the language of the people around him, and he then formulated his observations into words in what he called the laws of thought, which are a reflection of how people thought and the way they use language. And he said there were 3 laws that when you looked at people, First, people seem to always to talk and act if a thing is what it is. That is to say, a man is a man and truth is truth. Second, people talk and conduct themselves generally if they take it for granted that something cannot be, both be a particular thing and also not be a particular thing. That is to say, something cannot be both a man and not a man, or something cannot be both true and not true. And then third and finally, people speak and behave as they assume that anything must be a particular thing or it must not be a particular thing. People are oriented in an either-orish or two-valued logic. It's either this or it's that. They have a penchant to divide the world into two opposing forces and to ignore or deny the existence of any middle ground. Anything is either a man or it is not a man, or anything is either true or it is not true. And he felt these three principles, when taken together, represented the basic structure of the way that people shape their feelings, their thoughts, and their behaviors. They seem to act and talk as if they believe the world further, as they act and talk as if they believe the world consists of things, substance, which have certain characteristics or attributes. Aristotle, using his language so that you'll have a little of the vocabulary, that he said there are three laws then that I've described. The law of identity, everything is what it is. The law of non-contradiction, a thing cannot both be and not be so and so. And the law of the excluded middle, a thing either is or is not so and so.
So you just brought
Doesn't
up,
this make sense? Isn't this something that everybody believes? Isn't this common sense?
so you brought up the idea of thought and language.
Yes.
And what strikes me when we have these types of discussions is from in here, inside of our heads, it seems that these words match reality that's out there. It's that the word was made up for the reality. So when I think of the word pen, I say, well, the word was made up to describe the pen, right? It was like we made up word to describe pen, but it's really more that it seems that the word was made up for the mind, because the word is how the mind works and not how the pen works. I don't know if this is making sense, but that the mind has a way of working and that language was made more for the mind so that we could relate to things than it was made for the objects. One of the...
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that there's this, these laws are based on an underlying assumption that language mirrors reality. Language mirrors reality. Now, this is the challenge. If we look at the structure of language, regarded extensionally and scientifically, these laws are the laws of Indo-European grammar. They form the deep structure of our language and our thinking processes. All Aristotle assumed was that the structure of his and our language would mirror the structure of whatever reality is. In other words, all Aristotle assumed was that the operations within the symbols, if they were good grammatically, would necessarily reflect the structure of what is out there. So as Eben is asking, does language then mirror reality? Does reality mirror language? And once again, language is the greatest trap there is.
Or does language mirror the mind?
Okay, does language mirror the mind is the other side of the equation, which is where we need to go.
And what I'm just trying to point to, and I think what you're pointing to as well, is to get us to really get that these words that we have running through our mind and these concepts and the way that we use them unconsciously, we just take it as a given. but that's just one way of doing things, and that one limits us and keeps a whole bunch of reality and experience kind of well out of view in the blind spot. Okay, so
So does everybody believe these things? So are the laws of thought true? Let's take a vote and see how you come out on this test. This will determine whether you pass or fail the course, and we normally like to try to get this over early in the thing. So if you're going to pass, you can relax, and if not, you can stop worrying about it and simply get on with life. So how many people think everything is what it is? Come on. How many people think, thank you for one person being honest. How many of you
Two
think-
honest people.
Two honest people, okay. How many people think a thing cannot be and not be? Or A could not both be and not be? Okay, more people on that one. Okay. And how many of you think a thing either is or is not so-and-so? A either is or is not B, that we've got an either-or structure of the way the world operates? A few less. Okay, more people are for the law of non-contradiction.
how many
and the
people have
law
no
of
idea what
excluded
we're
middle.
talking about here? Okay, good. More honest people.
Okay. So the question is then, if you don't believe these happen to be the case, then why do you not believe this rather than simply assuming that you're being led into a trap, which of course you are, and being smart enough to figure that out and figuring the best thing to do is simply to not take a stand, and therefore you could go on. So part of the problem is these laws are not just a matter of words. They deal with the orientation by which we live. They operate at the unconscious level, and they form the structure of the language that we habitually use. They're almost impossible to avoid. They're embedded into the very structure of thought, into the very way we operate. So, now, one thing we need to understand is we need to make a distinction, we will as we continue, between formal logic. Logic has to do with symbols. And so logic has to do with the relationship between symbols. So logic will say that A implies B, and therefore if we have A, then B follows. So logic is about connections, it's about relationships, but logic doesn't tell us whether something is true or not. In order to determine, it only tells us whether the reasoning is true or not. And if we start with invalid premises, we'll reach invalid conclusions using logic to do so. So to find out whether the premises we start with are true or false, we've got to look at the way the world is and inspect the premises. But logic simply starts with the assumption that the premises are true, and if they're true, it determines what follows from them. But, so therefore in logic and in language and in arguments, then people will argue, and frequently it's not the challenge with the logic. The logic and the reasoning is usually fairly accurate. People are usually pretty good at that. The problem is that the assumptions they start with and the validity of those assumptions. So that's one thing we need to keep in mind as we go through this. So one of the things, so what is wrong with the laws of thought? What exactly is wrong with them? And so they're metaphysical statements about the way the world are. They're not statements about the way language is. They're statements about the way that language operates and of the structure of the language. And, but they're making certain assumptions about the way the world is, certain assumptions that things don't change, that there is a either-orness to the way the world is. So the problem is that these are empirically false to the kind of world that we happen to be in. Although they are grammatically valid, the structure of the symbolism does not reflect the structure of our world at the process level of events. So the first law states a word means what it means. Within the same discourse, a thing remains what it is. But a word cannot remain the same thing on two different occasions. Each time you use a word, then you're using it in a slightly different sense. And things grow, they evolve, they change over time. A thing never remains what it is. Heraclitus said you can never step into the same river twice. And so identification is a process or activity and not a characteristic of nature. So in our thoughts, what we do is we see continuity, and then we attribute identity to that, and we assume, well, there's something there that's there, and that it remains unchangeable. But things are always changing, and we can track that. We're used to that. So the first thing is, things are not fixed, rigid, determined. Things are continually in the process of change. And so if we start with this basic thing that a thing is always what it is, we're stuck in a world of sameness. We're stuck in the past. We're stuck in an unchanging world. The second law states that a thing cannot both be and not be. Now, this is the one most of you voted that was undeniable. So this means if I classify something one way, then it can't be anything else. Now then, we're getting to the crux of the problem. The challenge is that classification is a human activity, and properties reside in the human mind and not in nature. I'll repeat that because that's the biggie. That's the crux of the whole thing. Classification is a human activity. It's a mental activity. In the mind is where the categories exist. They don't exist in nature. And then we put things in nature in those categories. But then we begin to think that the categories are actually there in nature and don't realize they only exist in the mind. And properties reside in the human mind and not in things. So what happens, we look out in the world, we see things, we describe certain properties, we assume that properties are inherent in the things. Properties don't exist in the things out there. Properties exist in our mind. And as we'll come on in a minute, we'll see, and frequently then these properties are only a partial description, an abstraction of what's there. The third law is the law of two-valued logic. It says that a two-valued logic system is both necessary and sufficient. Thing must either be or not be. Statement must be either true or false. This leaves out all of the qualifications that we need to fit statements into territories, results in a rigid, unreal, and conflict-producing orientation. Multi-value logics are used extensively in science. In quantum mechanics, one of the first things one of the ways to try to explain the classic two-slit experiment, which says it's either got to be a wave or it's got to be a particle. And in two-valued logic, it can't be both. And so one of the classic interpretations of quantum mechanics is a multi-valued thing that says we don't need this either or. And so whenever we use the word or, we can use it in two senses. One, we can use it and it's either this or that, or not both, and not both. Or we could use it as it's either this or that, or possibly both. Most people in the language, the way you use it, you frequently use the inclusive or, that it's either this or that, and can't be both. And you can now start being aware that in using your language, and that restricts you to two values, that restricts you. Whereas if you now then begin, it could be either or, either A or B or both, then that gives you a more broad options and begins to start to open up the world. So language fails.
Hang on a second.
Okay. Yes.
I just want to call attention to something. This is some of the most challenging stuff to deal with for a brain. Because we're not just suggesting that the way you thought things were isn't the way they are. What we're suggesting is that the way you thought isn't the way things are. And not the way you thought things are isn't the way things are. It's the way you thought isn't the way that things are. Okay, it's another level deeper of challenging our whole conception of everything. And that It's all resting on other processes, other things that are unconscious. We might describe the level that we're talking at as a very deep belief level, a very, very deep beliefs. And as Wyatt and I will talk about later in the program, these structures have protective mechanisms. They each have a little Navy SEAL team, okay, that's backed up by F-16 airplanes and an army of 1 million infantry, okay? They've got the whole thing. And when you start operating at this level, the easiest thing to do is to just go, all right, I don't know where they're at. Zone out of this one. It's just too abstract. When a person has their beliefs threatened, what they do is they begin typically behaving like an addict. And we all do this. Okay? We become blind to it. We don't see it. We don't look at it. We become confused. We stop trying. Right? We don't look for the shadow running away from us. We just say, that's not real. And I'm not saying that you're doing this necessarily. I'm just saying, as we dive deeper into this stuff, okay, we're just cracking the door open and a little couple of rays of light are starting to shine in. And you can either go like this, or you can say, okay, let's open that door up and let's look in there. Because there's a lot more of this coming. This is just kind of opening up the door, the theoretical, so that we can get a view with our eyes, get a glimpse of what we're dealing with. We'll work with a lot of tools and other techniques that will be more interactive, but we got to power through this one.
Okay, so now, when once again we look at the structure of our language, at the heart of our language is the verb to be. Now, we think, well, what could possibly be wrong with that? And the verb to be has at least 4 meanings, of which 2 are problematic. One is simply the auxiliary meaning and saying it is sunny. Second is that to indicate existence, to say I am or she is. And these usually don't create problems, but there are 2 uses of it that create major problems, and this is the way we habitually use language and we habitually think. So, first is the one that's problem is that the 2 uses are identity and predication. So if we say that Eben is a great speaker, or this page is white, in one case we put an object in our class, and in the other we ascribe a quality to an object. But as we have seen, classifying and predication are human activities. Classes and properties or qualities exist in human minds and not in nature. So these 2 linguistic structures lead to what we call identification. This occurs whenever we confuse or identify what we say about the world with what it is. This is what it all comes down to. When we confuse or identify what we say about the world with the way the world actually is. In the is of identity, we confuse the human activity of classification with something out there in the world. And in the is of predication, we project out into the world the results of the human activity of perception.
So the crux of the matter here?
The crux of the matter.
Confusing our thoughts about the world with the world. We've come all the way back around to where we started. This is the structure of how we confuse the map with the territory. And what we're saying here, what Wyatt's saying here, is not that we go, oh, the map isn't the territory. But what we're saying here is that this was wired into the whole system that we got from birth, that we've been listening to, that we've been watching other humans use as their reasoning system, and that we swim in this like a fish swims in water. And that just because you say to a fish, hey, you're swimming in water, the fish doesn't go, oh, and then sprout wings and then go start flying. And the best we can do is kind of learn to manage this. Another thing Wyatt said that is very critical to understand is that initial conditions are important. You may have heard this in systems thinking. Initial conditions are critical. A good example that we've talked about already in the program, our upbringing, the traumas, the things that happened as a child, that we've got these games and these arbitrary mechanisms. Remember the pigeon bobbing its head and the mouse or the rat running around in a circle to get the food? And we keep playing those patterns out through our lives unconsciously, and those affect the success of our relationships, the success of our business, our financial success, right, our happiness at a contextual level, and our minds have adapted to them, so they rationalize them. Same thing here, very sensitive to initial conditions. And we all got this, and almost like if you got a new computer, and as soon as you got it, it got infected by some really weird spyware that caused it to run slow, and in order to use the browser, you had to open the browser with like 4 other programs, and you always had to close this pop-up that came up, and you had to learn to adapt to it. We've learned to adapt to it, and we're so wired with it and we're so accustomed to using the computer with the adware and the spyware on it that it doesn't make sense to go back and take the spyware off completely, because that would literally be debilitating, unless you want to go through a very long, involved process. And so what we want to do is we just want to wake up and go, okay, so I got some adware and some spyware on here, and maybe I want to move part of it. Maybe I want to learn some new tools. Maybe I want to learn to manage it. Maybe I want to start using another computer system over here a little bit of the time. Okay, so we're going to adapt. We're not going to get too weird about it, but we also don't want to deny it. We don't want to be in denial about it and just say, well, okay, whatever. If I've got it, then I'm not going to worry about it, because then we just go on in our same pre-programmed pattern doing things that are very counterproductive to success. Okay, very counterproductive to success on all levels, physically, emotionally, and logically.
Okay, let me give you a couple of quotes. First is from The Structure of Magic by Grinder and Bandler. A number of people in the history of civilizations have made this point, that there is an irreducible difference between the world and our experience of it. We as human beings do not operate directly on the world. Each of us creates a representation of the world in which we live. That is, we create a map or model which we use to generate our behavior. Our representation of the world determines to a large degree what our experience of the world will be. How we perceive the world, what choices we see available to us as we live in the world. Next quote, Korzybski. The main difficulties ahead are neurosemantic and neurolinguistic, because for more than 2,000 years, our nervous systems have been canalized in the inadequate, intentional, often delusional Aristotelian orientation, which are reflected even in the structure of the language we habitually use. Von Voigt, who was a great science fiction writer, then one of the best ways or a great place to learn about the null A, or non-Aristotelian, is a couple of science fiction books he wrote in which the characters are embody general semantics and live in a null A universe. Aristotle's formulation of the science of his time were probably the most accurate available during his lifetime. His followers for 2,000 years subscribed to the identification that they were true for all time. In more recent years, new systems of measurement disproved many of these truths, but they continue to be the basis of the opinions and beliefs of most people. The two-valued logic on which such folk thought is founded has accordingly been given the designation Aristotelian, abbreviation A. And the many-valued logic of modern science has been given the name non-Aristotelian, or null A. Further, Korzybski, children, immature adults, and animals identify. Whenever a person reacts to a new or changing situation as if it were an old or unchanging one, he or she is said to be identifying. Such an approach to life is Aristotelian. Now then, what can we do about this? So Korzybski had some actual suggestions, which we're going to go into in a second. But finally, what he said, and he called these suggestions in the form of them general semantics. And so general semantics is a discipline and not a philosophy. Any number of new null-A-oriented philosophies are possible, just as any number of geometrical systems can be developed. Possibly the most important requirement of civilization is the development of a null-A-oriented politico-economic society. It can be stated categorically that no such system has yet been developed. The field is wide open for bold and imaginative young men and women to create a system that will free mankind from war, poverty, and tension. In order to do this, it will be necessary to take control of the world away from people who identify. So what can we do about this then? So what is the case if the laws of thought are a metaphysical view of the way the reality of the world is? And what can we actually say? To accurately reflect the structure of reality, the laws of thought would need to be restated as follows. The law of non-identity. No two objects are absolutely identical. A thing is always changing and never is equal to itself. A is not A. This means, among other things, that the word is not the object, or the name given to a fact is not identical with the fact, or that the map is not the territory, or an inference is not a description. In general, a given abstract is not the abstract from which it has been abstracted, nor is it an abstract of itself. Whatever you say a fact is, it is not. Second, the law of non-allness. This means that the word does not represent all the object, nor does the map represent all of the territory. In general, what is abstracted at one level does not represent all that is abstracted at another level. So whenever we describe anything, we're only giving always a partial description. Third, the law of self-reflexiveness. This means that words can be about words and maps of maps. Language may be used to talk about language, statements made about statements, and evaluations made about evaluations, abstracts about abstracts. This brings in the concept of meta, so that we can talk about the world, we can talk about the language we use to talk about the world, we can talk about the language we use to talk about the language we use to talk about the world. And this is going to be important as we go through the rest of the seminar, that we begin to start tracking these levels of meta and begin to understand then what level we're operating at. Fourth is the law of contradiction, which seemed to be the one that was most obvious to everyone. A thing cannot both be and not be so-and-so. A thing can both be itself and something else. A can equal not A. This means that this is big. Contradiction exists only in the human mind and in symbolism and not in nature. The world does not come neatly sorted into polar opposites. Opposites are projected onto the world by human beings. Contradiction exists in the mind, not in the world. And last, the law of the excluded middle, which many of you wanted to buy into, and whether you wanted to buy into it or not, the way you talk, the way you behave, indicates that on an unconscious level, you operate out of an either-or type world. A thing may both be and not be so-and-so. A thing may both be of two mentally exclusive things. A may be both A and not A. This means the world does not come in either-or or black and white. The world is multidimensional, and great distortion occurs when it is fit into pigeonholes without the necessary qualifications and systemic disclaimers. In other words, whatever thing you say is a simplification and is wrong. and requires qualification in order to understand it. Everything you say is part true and part false, and we focus on the part true, and we don't focus on the rest of it. So this is the case, but Korzybski, fortunately, wasn't simply going to leave us stranded there. So what he said is, then we need some techniques, and he came up with some suggestions. These are things we can actually do to begin to work with it. He says it is not enough to know about null techniques. They must be learned on the automatic, that is, the unconscious level. The talking about stage must give way to the doing stage. The goal is flexibility of approach below the verbal level to any event. General semantics is designed to give the individual a sense of direction, not a new sense of inflexibilities. So what are some of these things then that we need to be aware of? And what are some techniques that we can use to create sanity? And Korzybski's General Semantics and his writings are basically, and his followers in the Society of General Semantics are basically then making an effort to implement these things. Okay, so these are some of the things we can do. Remember that maturity and sanity is not any one set of opinions, but a way of evaluating situations. These are training techniques. Some of them are. Since an object or an event contains many properties, be aware that any statement about it abstracts only a few of its characteristics. What we call an object or event is not what it is. Our knowledge is always limited. We always see in part and know in part. For example, Eben is wise means that wisdom is one of his characteristics, and he may have many others which you may possibly never know all. Be aware of projection. Substitute, it seems to me, or it appears, for it is. So one of the things we talked about is the use of the word is, and instead of making the hard statement that this is the way the world is, which is what we do every time we use it, if we were to substitute it appears or it seems, then we're aware that we're talking about our perceptions and not making statements about the way the world is. Since the world is in process and constantly changing, date all labels and statements and expect change. No one thing is ever twice the same. Static statements and final formulations are always outmoded. For example, advanced behavioral modeling, 1991, is working with the US diving team. And Russia, 1990, is governed by a communist dictatorship. Things are always subject to change. So therefore, if we were to learn to date each of the statements, then this helps us reflect and be aware that the statement is describing a particular temporal place and that change is to be expected. Since every person and process is individual and different, index all labels to call attention to individuality and difference. No two things are identical, and no word has exactly the same meaning twice. So one of the things is when we go to a dictionary, we find that the words have different definitions in the dictionary. And therefore, we get confused because words have different meanings, can be used in different senses, and we don't necessarily know what sense people are using it. Korzybski suggested, and some of his suggestions are good ideas that they're not particularly necessarily practical, or they've been formulated, but the idea would be to have a standard dictionary that everybody used, and every time you used a word that was in the dictionary, then you would simply put a number for which one of the different definitions in the dictionary that referred to. Since every individual and thing contains many attributes, use the word etc. to indicate that only some attributes are being abstracted. One cannot say all or know all about everything. For example, Eben is a great guy. Be aware that Eben is much more than great. He is also nice, kind, helpful, generous, suave, debonair, meaning he also has other characteristics.
A lot more than that, too.
I know, much more than that. Since words have multi-ordinal or many-valued meanings, use quotations For instance, quotation, conscious, unquotation, and quotation, unconscious, end quotation, mind, or useful descriptions. But it is yet to be proven in 1991 that these terms themselves accurately reflects the process level of events. These are maps of territory about which we can possibly never have exact information. Use quotations to indicate multi-ordinal or many-valued meanings. Be careful not to label, since human beings never quite fit any label. For example, words like communist, Democrat, Republican, Catholic, Protestant refer to human beings who never quite fit any label. Use a hyphen whenever elementary terms are united to produce non-elementary terms. Be aware of self-reflexiveness. A statement can be about reality, or it can be about a statement about reality, or it can be about a statement about reality. This is the level of meta, what we'll call the levels of recursion. And we need to be aware of what level we're operating at. And failure to make these distinctions leads to major paradoxes. And Russell and Whitehead, in living and writing their great opus, in which they wanted to reduce all of mathematics to set theory, called Principia Mathematica, found that when you failed to take into account these levels, then you ended up with contradictions that created major problems. But when you were able to distinguish whether you were talking about something or whether you were talking about the language you used to talk about it, then you begin to clear away some of the cobwebs. And be aware, use what delayed reactions based on what Korzybski called the thalamocortical pause. A delay of even of a fraction of a second allows the mind to consider alternatives, a self-imposed delay. And then one of the most extreme measures we already touched on in defense of sanity is what Korzybski called a revised version of the English language. It was an interesting language. It simply took the English language and eliminated the verb to be, and he called it E prime, English prime. And there's even software that you can use now to take whatever you've written and we'll go through it and we'll strip out every use of the verb to be and we'll substitute one of the things we talked about, which is it appears or it seems. So it's a more descriptive, extensionally oriented derivative of English, one that automatically tends to bring the user back to the level of the first person experience. Also, practical observation in this order: observation, investigation, or direct experience first, and then words, descriptions, inferences, observation before talking, description before judgment, facts before opinion. Note that it may be awkward and necessary to say or write out these devices, except at times for emphasis or to make a point. The place they need to be applied is inside in one's own thinking and in one's own internal dialogue.